No one wanted 3 pregnant Chinese girls at auction until Infertile rancher bought and protected them. The auctioneer's voice was a shard of glass in the heat-shimmered air, grating and cheap. Dust, fine as ground bone, coated every surface, clinging to the sweat on the faces of the men gathered in the derelict ranch yard. It was a place of endings. Arthur stood at the back, a statue carved from shadow and grief, the worn black of his coat drinking the relentless sun. For 5 years since the fever took his wife, Sarah, and the babe that followed her, his world had been this same oppressive silence, this same bleached-out landscape of loss. He came to these wretched affairs not to buy, but to watch things break, to see other lives dismantled. It was a bitter communion. Today they brought out the last of the miller's imported labor. Not cattle or horses, but people. 3 young Chinese women, their silk black hair catching the harsh light, were led onto the splintered block. Their hands were bound loosely before them. The crowd shifted, a low murmur of pity and disdain. They were burdens. Mai, the eldest, held her chin high, a fragile fortress of defiance built behind eyes as dark as polished stone. Lian, her own eyes wide with a terror that seemed too large for her slight frame, stood so close to Mai she was nearly hidden. And Shu, the youngest, stared at her own swollen belly as if it were a strange and terrible planet she had been forced to inhabit. All 3 were pregnant. Liabilities, the auctioneer spat, waving a dismissive hand. Indentured, but their time is near. The late miller's poor planning is your potential gain, or your folly, he grinned, revealing teeth the color of old corn. Who will start the bidding for this fertile lot? Silence answered him. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. The men looked away, shuffling their feet. Who would take on 3 foreign women, 3 mouths to feed, soon to be 6? They were seen not as mothers, but as monuments to a poor investment. A horse with a lame leg held more value. Arthur felt a familiar cold ache in his chest, a phantom hollowness where his family used to be. He saw not liabilities, but a reflection of his own stolen future. The life he and Sarah had planned, the children they would have raised on their small ranch. All of it turned to dust, just like the ground beneath his worn boots. A slick, oily voice cut through the stillness. $10. Bartholomew Thorne stepped forward, his shadow falling long and predatory across the sisters. He was a vulture in a tailored coat, a man who fed on the misfortunes of others, buying up failed ranches and broken lives for pennies. A cruel smile played on his lips as he looked at the women, his gaze lingering on their rounded forms with an owner's appraisal. He wasn't buying mothers. He was buying stock. The auctioneer's eyes lit with relief. $10 from Mr. Thorne. Do I hear 15? The silence returned thicker this time, laced with the finality of Thorne's claim. The sisters flinched as one. Mai's facade of courage crumbled, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The gavel was raised. It hung in the air, a suspended moment of doom. In that sliver of time, Arthur saw it all. Thorne's leering triumph, the sisters' despair, the ghosts of his own lost family whispering in the wind. The silence in his heart, the one he had nurtured for 5 years, suddenly screamed. 20. The word was rust and disuse, torn from a throat that had forgotten how to speak with force. Every head turned. Arthur stepped from the shadows, his form stark and unyielding. The sun caught the silver of his dusty belt buckle. Thorne's smile curdled. He looked him up and down, dismissing him. The widower? What use do you have for them? His voice was a sneer. Arthur's eyes, chips of flint, met his. 25. Thorne's face flushed with anger. He would not be challenged by this ghost of a man. 30. 50, Arthur said, the word ringing with the clarity of a bell. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a fortune for a man alone, for land that barely produced. It was everything he had left. Thorne stared, his greed warring with his pride. He saw the cold, unshakable certainty in Arthur's gaze and knew he could not win this battle without revealing the true depth of his cruelty. And even he had a reputation to maintain. He spat on the ground. Let the madman have them. They'll be his ruin. The auctioneer, stunned, slammed the gavel down. Sold. To the widower. Arthur walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate. He did not look at Thorn. He did not look at the stunned faces of the men. He looked only at the three sisters, whose eyes now held a new emotion, more fragile and more terrifying than fear, a sliver of hope. He paid the auctioneer with coin from a worn leather pouch, the metal heavy and real in his palm. Then, with a small, sharp knife he carried for mending harnesses, he walked to the block and one by one cut the ropes that bound their hands. The journey to the ranch was a pilgrimage through a world of baked earth and brittle light. The sun was a hammer beating down on the four of them as they walked. Arthur led the way, his stride long and purposeful, a stark contrast to the hesitant, shuffling steps of the sisters behind him. No words were spoken. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the parched ground and the whisper of the wind through skeletal sagebrush. The landscape was a mirror of Arthur's soul, vast, empty, and scarred by a relentless sun. To the sisters, it was a terrifying expanse, a world away from the shaded confines of their past life. They clutched the meager bundles of their belongings, their gazes darting nervously across the horizon, as if expecting some new horror to emerge from the shimmering heat. After 2 hours that felt like a lifetime, the homestead appeared, a low shape huddled against the vastness. It was a small, sturdy ranch house of hewn logs, a testament to his own hands, flanked by a barn and a fenced-in corral. The place was impeccably clean, obsessively ordered, but it was a sterile tidiness. There were no stray chickens pecking in the yard, no laundry dancing on a line, no sign of the messy, vibrant pulse of life. It was a home held in stasis, preserved in the amber of grief. Arthur pushed open the door, revealing a single room, shadowed and cool. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made, occupied one corner. "There," he said, his voice flat, gesturing to a partitioned-off space behind a thick curtain. "You will sleep there." He pointed to the stove, the pantry. "The food is yours. The well is outside. Do not waste the water." His instructions were clipped, practical, devoid of any warmth. He was providing sanctuary, not welcome. The sisters huddled together in their designated corner, a small island of shared fear in the ocean of Arthur's solitude. They spoke in whispers, their words in a language Arthur did not understand, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. Arthur moved with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency, tending to his chores with a focus that seemed designed to block out their very presence. He ate his meals alone at the table, a solitary king in his kingdom of sorrow. But their presence was an undeniable fact. It was a rustle of fabric behind the curtain, a shared sigh in the night, the soft pad of 3 extra pairs of feet on the floorboards. It was a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, a disturbance in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Arthur found himself listening against his will to the rhythm of their breathing as they slept. A few days later, Leanne, the middle sister, was drawing water from the well when the heat overwhelmed her. She swayed, her face ashen, and crumpled to the ground. Arthur was inside mending a leather strap when he heard the bucket clang against the stone well. A primal, forgotten instinct surged through him. He was outside in a heartbeat, his solitary calm shattered. He knelt, lifting Leanne's head into his lap, his hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed the hair from the girl's damp forehead. Mai and Shu rushed out, their faces masks of panic. Arthur looked up at them, and for the first time, they saw a crack in his hardened facade. They saw not a cold warden, but a man shaken by a profound and buried fear. "Get a wet cloth," he commanded, but the harshness was gone, replaced by a raw urgency. Quickly, as Mai pressed the cool cloth to her sister's face, Arthur held Leanne, a fragile weight in his arms, and felt the tremors of a life that was not his own, a vulnerability he had paid a fortune to protect. The silence of his world had been broken, not by a word, but by a near fall, a shared moment of terror that bound the 4 of them together in the unforgiving sun. Life on the ranch began to find a new, fragile rhythm. The silence that had once been a shield slowly receded, replaced by the quiet industry of 4 people working toward a common survival. The sisters, sensing the shift that had occurred by the well, began to emerge from their shell of fear. They started small, sweeping the porch without being asked, pulling the most stubborn weeds from the parched vegetable garden. Their movements were tentative at first, then grew in confidence. Arthur watched them from a distance, his expression unreadable. He issued his instructions in the same sparse, direct manner, but the lessons themselves were a form of communion. He showed me how to properly sight down the barrel of the old rifle, his calloused hand briefly covering hers to adjust her grip. He taught Shu which desert herbs were safe for tea and which were poison, their fingers brushing as they sorted through the dried leaves. He worked with Lian to repair a sagging section of the corral fence, the rhythmic pounding of their hammers a strange new music in the quiet air. These were not gestures of affection but of necessity. Yet in this harsh land, necessity was its own kind of intimacy. The homestead itself began to transform. A line of washed clothes, small shifts and mended dresses, flapped in the breeze, a banner of defiant domesticity. The scent of baking bread, coarse and grainy, sometimes filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of dust and wood smoke that had lingered for years. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and a rare storm gathered on the horizon, the four of them sat inside, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin. The fire in the hearth, now a nightly ritual, crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The tension of the storm outside seemed to seep into the room, a heavy, expectant silence. It was Shu, the quietest of the three, who broke it. She began to hum a low, sweet melody in her native tongue that was both mournful and hopeful. It was a lullaby from a place they had lost, a thread of sound, weaving a tapestry of memory and longing in the small, warm space. Mai and Lian joined in, their voices soft harmonies that wrapped around Shu's melody. They sang for their lost home, for their uncertain future, for the tiny, sleeping lives within them. Arthur sat perfectly still in his chair by the fire, his back to them. His hands were clenched in his lap, his knuckles white. He did not turn. He did not speak. He did not join their song. But he did not stop it, either. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek, glittering in the firelight before falling silently onto the dark fabric of his trousers. He was no longer just a warden. He was a witness. In the nights that followed, he would lie awake and listen to their hushed conversations from behind the curtain. He learned their histories in fragments, piecing together a story of a long journey across an ocean, of profound trauma and even more profound resilience. And in listening, he felt the thick walls he had built around his own heart begin to crumble, stone by painful stone. The dog, a stray he'd never named but fed scraps to, began to bark at the eastern horizon in the mornings, a low, anxious sound directed at nothing they could see. A faint dust cloud, a distant smudge against the blue sky, would appear and then vanish. The signs were there. A storm was coming, but this one would not be of wind and rain. The day Bartholomew Thorn arrived, the air was still and heavy, holding its breath. The nameless dog, usually silent, let out a single sharp bark before slinking under the porch, whining. Arthur was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a measure of his newfound peace. He paused, his head tilted, listening. And then he heard it, the steady, arrogant beat of approaching horses. He placed the axe down gently and wiped his hands on his trousers. Inside the cabin, the sisters froze, the sound a harbinger of a past they thought they had escaped. Mai grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth, her face pale but determined. Lian and Shu huddled together, their hands protectively on their bellies. Arthur stepped onto the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the dark interior of the cabin. He waited. Thorn reined in his horse a few yards from the house, flanked by two hard-faced men whose hands rested near the pistols on their hips. He surveyed the homestead, a look of contemptuous amusement on his face. The clothesline, the tended garden, it was all an affront to his sense of order. "Widower," he called out, his voice slick with false courtesy. "I've come to correct a mistake." Arthur remained silent, his stillness a challenge. His eyes were fixed on him, 2 points of cold, hard light. "A man's bid at a scrapper's auction holds no legal weight," he lied smoothly. "I had a prior claim on their indenture, a debt owed to me by the late miller. These girls, and what they carry, are my property." He said the word property with a smug finality, as if it were an undeniable law of nature. Arthur's voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. "They are not for sale," Thorn chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Everything has a price, old man. Now send them out. We can do this peacefully, or we can do it my way." He nodded to his men, a silent command. One of them dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth as he started toward the porch. He was halfway there when Arthur disappeared into the cabin. He re-emerged a moment later, and he was no longer just a grieving widower. In his hands, he held his rifle. He did not raise it in a panic, he held it with a familiar, practiced ease. The worn stock settled perfectly against his shoulder. The transformation was absolute. The 5 years of solitude, of fending for himself in this unforgiving land, had honed him into something Thorn and his men could not possibly comprehend. They saw a lone man. They did not see the predator whose territory they had just invaded. "Get off my land," he said, his voice devoid of fear. The man paused, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He glanced back at Thorn, who sneered. "He's bluffing. Get the girls." The man took another step. A deafening crack echoed across the yard. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust an inch from his boot. He yelled and scrambled back. Thorn's face contorted in a mask of fury. "You foolish bastard," he roared, drawing his own pistol. "Get him!" The world exploded into motion. Arthur fired again, not at Thorn, but at the support beam of the porch overhang above his head. Splinters rained down, causing his horse to rear in panic. He used the moment to duck behind the thick logs of the cabin wall, reloading with a calm efficiency that was terrifying to behold. The two hired men, recovering their nerve, charged forward, firing wildly. Bullets chewed at the wood around him. Inside, Mai wedged the heavy table against the door, creating a barricade. She, Lian, and Shu crouched low, their world reduced to the sounds of gunfire and splintering wood, their shared terror a prayer for the man outside. Arthur was a ghost, using the angles of his own home as a weapon. He fired from a window, then from behind the stone well. His shots were precise and purposeful. He wasn't trying to kill them, he was trying to break them. One man screamed as a bullet tore through the fleshy part of his arm. The other fell back as his pistol was shot from his hand, his fingers numb and stinging. Thorn, his face a mess of rage and disbelief, finally charged the cabin himself. He burst onto the porch, intending to kick down the door. Arthur met him there. He didn't fire. He swung the heavy rifle like a club, the steel barrel catching him across the jaw with a sickening crunch. He staggered back, spitting blood and a broken tooth, his eyes wide with shock. He had expected a victim. He had found a warrior. Defeated, bleeding, and utterly humiliated, he stumbled back to his horse. His men, one clutching a wounded arm, the other his throbbing hand, followed suit. Bartholomew Thorn looked back one last time at the man standing on the porch, a silent, formidable guardian framed by the home he was defending. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a cold, hard promise. He wheeled his horse around and fled, his retreat leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the ringing silence of victory. The echo of the last gunshot faded, leaving a silence more profound than any that had come before. The dust, stirred by the panicked retreat of Thorn's horses, slowly settled back onto the earth, a golden veil in the late afternoon sun. Arthur stood on the porch, the heavy rifle still warm in his hands. His knuckles were bruised. A thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his temple, but his posture was unbroken. He watched the dust cloud of his enemies disappear over the horizon, ensuring they were truly gone. Slowly, the cabin door creaked open. Mai emerged first, her eyes wide, the iron poker still clutched in her hand. She saw Arthur, saw the blood, and rushed forward. Lian and Shu followed, their faces tear-streaked but etched with a new, fierce awe. Without a word, Mai took a clean cloth from her pocket and gently dabbed at the cut on Arthur's temple. It was a simple, intimate gesture that spoke more than words ever could. It was an anointing. In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. Arthur allowed the touch, his stiff shoulders relaxing for the first time. He looked from Mai's determined face to Lian's trembling relief to Shu's quiet gratitude. He saw not his burdens, but his garrison. They had faced the storm together and held the line. That evening, they did not eat in shifts or in silence. They sat together at the table, the four of them, the empty chair that had long been a shrine to Sarah's memory now simply a part of their circle. The meal was meager, but it felt like a feast. The home was no longer a tomb of memory. It was a fortress, consecrated by their shared courage. Life resumed, but it was irrevocably changed. The quiet purpose of their work was now laced with a thread of joy. They were no longer just surviving. They were building. The first snows of winter came, blanketing the harsh land in a soft, forgiving white. And with the changing of the seasons came new life. Leanne was the first, with a boy who had a tuft of dark hair and a surprisingly loud cry that filled the small cabin with a sound it had not known in years. Then came Mai's daughter, small and quiet with her mother's watchful eyes. Finally, Shu gave birth to a son as the first spring thaw began to melt the snow. The cabin, once a vessel of silence and grief, now overflowed with the chaotic, beautiful music of life. The cries, the gurgles, the soft lullabies sung by three new mothers became the homestead's heartbeat. Arthur became the axis around which this new world turned. He was no longer a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. He was a guardian, a patriarch of this unconventional family. He held the babies with a tenderness that surprised even himself, the ache in his arms finally filled. He watched as the sisters showed each other how to swaddle, how to soothe, how to see the future in a tiny, sleeping face. The grief for what he had lost did not vanish, but it was no longer an all-consuming void. It had become a part of a larger story, a foundational stone upon which this new, unexpected family was built. Years passed. The babies grew into toddlers, their laughter chasing the last of the shadows from the corners of the cabin. They called him Arthur, their small hands often finding his. One sun-drenched afternoon, Arthur sat on the porch step, carving a small wooden bird, his knife moving with practiced skill. His own father had taught him how long ago. For years, the hobby had been a painful reminder. Now, it was a legacy to be passed on. He watched as Mai, Leanne, and Shu played with their children in the yard, their silhouettes dark against the brilliant orange of the setting sun. Leanne's boy ran to him, his face bright with some new discovery. He smiled, a true, unburdened smile that reached his flinty eyes and softened them. The homestead was no longer empty. The land was no longer a barren testament to his loss. It was a garden, stubbornly and beautifully cultivated, teeming with the life he had bought, protected, and nurtured. He had gone to the auction seeking an echo of his own brokenness, but had found instead the seeds of his own salvation.